right. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to another HS2 seminar. So tonight we'll be going through some important updates for the 2023-2024 college application season. So if you are a college senior or high school senior, sorry, in the audience tonight, you will probably find this exceptionally helpful. If you are a younger student or a parent of a younger student, this will maybe help you prepare in advance so that you'll have a better understanding of the pathway ahead, and you can use the updates in today's seminar so that you have a better understanding of what colleges are looking for these days. Okay, so my name is Patrick Tapia. I'm the VP for Counseling for HS2 Academy. And yeah, so let's start off by taking a look at the current college admissions landscape. As you're well aware, college admissions will only get harder every single year. As we can see here for the Ivy League acceptance rates, I think there is some good news in the sense that it's not always going down, right? There are certain schools, for instance, like Harvard sort of slightly rebounded last year. Some schools are even showing an upward trend, like Columbia, for example. But by and large, I think most of the other Ivies are showing a slight decrease from the previous year's acceptance rates. Now, one area where this is really pronounced is we see this a lot with private universities in major metropolitan areas. So we, of course, know Stanford, that's going to be really low, but some surprises, maybe for some of you, USC was under 10% for the first time ever. NYU is at a really, really low 8% now. I think some people are still in shock at Northeastern now being at about 5.6%. The previous year, it dropped pretty dramatically from 18% to about 6.7. People were kind of calling it a fluke, but this year actually proved that it was not, right? So Northeastern apparently is incredibly popular well, it's also a combination of them sort of having to reduce the class sizes. Some of the other colleges on this list, Rice at 7.7, that's pretty low. I think some people are more surprised about Boston University being at about close to 10% now, considering that in prior years, Boston University was probably widely considered more like a safer school for high achieving students. Okay, so what's going on? Why are these schools getting more and more competitive? Well, I mean, there's a simple fact that there are just simply more people applying to these colleges more than ever before. According to the Common App, which tracks the number of applications that people send, there was about a 7.5% increase in terms of the total submitted applications last year. And one of the key trends that they're noting here is that ever since the pandemic sort of subsided, there are a lot more people internationally who are now applying to U.S. colleges again, especially from China and India, right? These are the two main countries where we're getting the most number of international applicants. Some other things too is that because of some changes to the way college application works, there's been an increase in the percentage of underrepresented minorities and first-generation college students who are now applying. And this is in large part because of changes like many colleges going test optional, right? That, of course, will have an impact in terms of, how easy it would be for them to apply. One of the changes that we're going to talk about later on as well, the changes to the FAFSA might apply or could actually increase the number of underrepresented minorities who are applying as well, because that's usually seen as one of the obstacles. They view colleges maybe potentially too expensive, but if it's easier for them to get financial aid, that's going to add more applicants to the pool in coming years. One interesting trend to note here is that it's not just simply that there are more people applying. The actual number of applications per applicant increased by about 8% last year, which means every single applicant is now applying to slightly more colleges than in previous years. Okay, so that's definitely something to keep in mind. Okay, there is some good news on the horizon. I think this was kind of a refreshing change. The UC campuses actually increased, I think across the board, increased their acceptance rates. And this is in large part because it's a combination of there's fewer applicants based on previous years, and they also, for some UC campuses, admitted more, especially for California students, than in previous years. So that's kind of good news, but like this is probably not going to be sustainable, right? So at some point, the UCs will get increasingly more applications, but just looking at the top two here, Los Angeles and Berkeley, you're looking at just a slight increase of about like 0.2% for both of them, right? Not a major increase, but like since we're so used to the UC acceptance rates decreasing every single year, this is kind of a welcome change. If you take a look at the mid-4, you'll notice similar trends. So one of the key things that we've been pointing at, like in previous seminars, is that especially if you're listening to this seminar and you're not from California, these 4 mid-tier UCs are probably going to be your best bet, right? Given that for out-of-state applicants, it's significantly higher in some cases than the overall rate and for the California rate, right? So there is a sort of like a debate going on within California right now, and of course, California legislators are putting more pressure on these UC campuses to accept more applicants from California more than ever before. And one of the campuses where we've seen this to be very true, UC Santa Cruz, spiked in terms of the acceptance rates because they actually increased the accepted students from California by a huge amount, right? So that is definitely one of the key things that we're noticing now here, right? So yeah, good news for the UCs. If that's one of the main school systems that you're interested in, they have a higher acceptance rate now. So that's certainly a welcome change. Okay, so for the first of our very big updates for today, we're going to talk about this development with the FAFSA and how it might impact your selection of EA or ED choices, right? So given that we're not necessarily going to be diving deep into financial aid, I'm not going to necessarily talk about the details of applying for financial aid, but this is definitely something worth noting because it might affect your decision to decide whether or not you're going to go apply for early decision or early action or not at all, right? So just to kind of brief you on this change, so this year, this fall marks the release of the new streamlined version of the FAFSA, fewer questions, more intelligently grouped. And so that is basically one of the key changes that they brought up. And in large part, they wanted to do that because too many people weren't applying because it was too long and too intimidating and just not very friendly to people who didn't know what was going on. And so oftentimes people needed help to fill out the FAFSA. So while that's certainly a welcome change, one of the key things, though, about this year in particular is that the new version of the FAFSA will not be launched until December of this year. Normally, they have the FAFSA available by October 1st, right? So normally you'd only need to wait a couple more weeks for the FAFSA to be launched. This year in particular, though, because of this delay, it does pose an interesting quandary for some students because if they are considering applying for early decision, there is that uncertainty about exactly how much financial aid they might be able to get for a school that they're applying to for early decision. And part of the reason for that dilemma is that if you apply ED, of course, it's a binding decision, which means if they accept you, you have to go, right? Now, of course, that's a problem if you're not sure whether or not you can pay for it. Okay, so let's talk about that first. If you are applying for ED, what does that mean for you? What are you going to need to do? Okay. So if you're an early applicant, right, early action or early decision. So let's take a look first at early action. If you're applying for early action, it's non-binding, which means you apply early, you find out if you get in or get denied early, but then you can always wait until all your regular decision schools come out before you decide which school you want to go to. So for all intents and purposes, this doesn't really impact you at all because when the FAFSA comes out, you file for it, you apply, you get your financial aid packages maybe a little bit later than your admissions decision, but still well in time for you to make an educated decision as to where you would want to go once you get the financial aid offers from other schools. So for early decision, it's probably not really going to impact you. If, however, you're applying for early decision, this is where it becomes slightly problematic. My recommendation for you would be to contact the school that you're thinking of applying to ED and find out what their policy is, right? So how are they planning to go ahead and make decisions on financial aid without the FAFSA? Now, in many cases, what you're going to need to do, many of the schools that are ED anyway, especially if they're like a private institution, will probably require you to fill out a supplemental financial aid form called the CSS profile, which is accessible through your student's College Board account, right? And so many schools require it anyway. So what they would just simply have you do is apply using the CSS profile. You'll be able to get a financial aid award letter that way. And any federal aid, because the CSS profile is largely used for institutional money, like money directly from that college in the form of things like grants, right? Or some loans, I guess. But if you're applying for federal financial aid, what they would do is, first of all, give you an estimate based on the numbers that you put on your CSS profile. And then once you can file the FAFSA in December, normally, even if you got in for ED, they don't expect your deposit until maybe like February 1st anyway. So you still have enough time before you have to fill it or send out your money to figure out what exactly the financial aid package would look like, including any federal grants or loans that you might get. Okay, so it is a bit trickier this year than in previous years, to be sure. So if you're on the fence about ED, definitely consider this as a factor before you decide to go ahead and apply for early decision. Okay. So what happens if you weren't planning to apply for financial aid anyway? Well, for one, this might present an interesting opportunity, I guess, in some ways, because with all the uncertainty about this, it might cause some people to be a little bit reluctant to apply for ED. And so if the applicant pool is slightly smaller, that might mean that you would have theoretically a slightly better chance than in previous years to go ahead and be accepted in the ED round. So this especially makes sense if you have a clear-cut number one choice school where you don't have any regrets at all. If you were kind of on the fence anyway, like you weren't sure whether or not you wanted to do ED, yeah, you might want to consider maybe just going early action for one or two schools and then compare financial aid packages or scholarship packages. Okay. However, since many schools these days, and you might have heard me talk about this in prior seminars, are now accepting a greater percentage of their incoming freshman classes through the early action or early decision rounds, this does represent a tremendous opportunity for you to enhance your chances of getting into your dream school. So definitely, plan it out. Definitely like look at all the different options available to you. And if it makes sense for you to go ED, yeah, it might actually be a really good year to try to go ED to your dream school. All right, so that's update number one. So the next other major change that we see on the horizon has to do with legacy status. So let me quickly explain what that is. So legacy admissions, if you're not familiar, is basically when colleges provide preferential consideration for the children of their alumni. Oftentimes this will probably be limited to parent alumni as opposed to grandparents or uncles or siblings or whatever, right? And this has been in use for decades, right? And in some cases, like there's been statistics out there, during the Harvard trial, for instance, where they found out that Harvard's white applicants, they found that around 40% of white accepted students to Harvard had largely benefited from either legacy status or some other VIP or, like important donor kind of contributions, right? So there's a lot of that going on where they prioritize specific students who are either children of alumni or maybe children of professors or, one or another kind of VIP status, okay? One of the rationales for keeping legacy status is that the developmental offices for these schools, the people who collect donations from people, they've found that there's a higher correlation of people who donate if they are the children of alumni or, if their kids go to the school, for instance. If there's that family connection, they found that historically there is a higher probability that they're going to give or give bigger, right? And so that has been the historical justification for these universities to go ahead and prioritize legacy admissions. But of course, in recent years, there's been a lot of sort of pushback. I guess people feel like it's unfair that you would give someone just by virtue of their birth or of having been born the son or daughter of a certain, alum, that you would give them a boost over someone else, especially given how competitive these schools have now gotten, right? Also, post the Supreme Court decision, that's also an interesting sort of development because one of the things that was debated is that like, hey, you know what, if you're going to do affirmative action or why don't you just get rid of legacy status? That would give more room for you to be able to kind of recruit people, and have a more diverse class, right? And so with that pressure, like some schools have in fact been, I guess, examining or reconsidering their legacy admissions policies. And some good news is that this year, and actually just over the last few years, there have been several colleges that have gotten rid of their legacy status policies, right? So this is the short list here. There might be some other schools that I wasn't aware of, but these are the notable ones that I've been able to find. Of course, some of the more notable ones here, MIT, Amherst, actually, they already announced that they weren't going to do legacy before the pandemic. But many of these schools like Carnegie Mellon, University of Minnesota, Virginia Tech, these were this year, they announced this year that they were going to get rid of their legacy policies. So how does that impact most of you? Well, if you are the child of an alum of one of these schools, obviously that's not as good news. But for everybody else who is not categorized in one of these legacy status categories, then of course it gives you a slightly better chance, I suppose, right? Because then there are fewer spots in these colleges that are going to be assigned for these students, right? Which means it does free up the overall pool. Now, how big of a difference? Obviously, it'll depend by institution, and depends on how colleges decide to fill in those slots. But for the most part, it still represents more spots available. So in just looking at it holistically, it is good news. Okay. All right. Next major update that I want to talk about has to do with what are called direct admit programs. And these programs are getting more and more selective. So really quickly, many colleges will typically have a separate admissions process to be admitted to some of their most popular majors. These include things like engineering, computer science, business in some cases, right? Um, Especially if they're very popular or they're very high ranked. And this is opposed to like some other colleges where typically they will accept you as an undeclared freshman. In many private universities, like the Ivies, for instance, you're not necessarily formally categorized as a certain major as soon as you're accepted. You have to declare your major, usually by the end of your sophomore year or by the beginning of your junior year. Same is true of certain notable public universities like UC Berkeley, for example. Traditionally, if you got accepted their College of Letters and Sciences, you weren't technically listed as data science or math or computer science. You were just an undeclared freshman, okay? Now, unfortunately, in recent years, these colleges have just been flooded with people trying to declare for these most popular majors, right? So, many people had been using a strategy called basically a strategy major, right, is what we call it in counseling, where you pick a major that adheres to or just like that I guess is supported very well by your activities, let's just say, and then you can pick that as a major, apply so that you look stronger for that major. Presumably that major will be less competitive or less selective, and then you could just change your major to some other major that's maybe more competitive or more popular. However, things are changing pretty dramatically because of the popularity of these certain majors. There are just too many people who are trying to declare for that major that many colleges are overwhelmed. They cannot provide enough like classrooms, professors, and resources for people who want to declare for certain majors. So what they've been doing here is that for certain select majors, they've made it so that you can only be accepted to that major if you were already accepted as a freshman, right? So that's what's changing with this, right? Now, in some cases, you might be able to switch to that major later on, but for the schools that have been highly ranked for things like computer science, it's becoming almost an impossibility to do that now. Okay, so some of the changes here are that, like, in some cases, like universities who didn't have direct admit programs are now making it so that they are direct admit. So, like recently last year, University of Michigan, for instance, instituted something called advanced selection criteria for students applying for computer science, which is in effect a direct admit. Okay, so one of the key changes that they noted here is that if you weren't accepted for advanced selection, it's going to be increasingly difficult for you to change majors. I think for Michigan, it might still be possible, but it's going to be very, very difficult because there'd be only few spots left. Okay. Now, one of the